Oklahoma Gardening is a production of the Oklahoma Cooperative Extension Service as part of the land grant mission of the Division of Agricultural Sciences and Natural Resources at Oklahoma State University, dedicated to improving the quality of life of the citizens of Oklahoma through research-based information. Underwriting assistance for our program is provided by the Oklahoma Department of Agriculture, Food, and Forestry, helping to keep Oklahoma green and growing. Today on Oklahoma Gardening, host Casey Hentges is spreading rainbows by dividing and replanting irises. In our tour of ornamental grasses, we get out of the sun to look at some shade grasses. And then we have some plants that look like grasses, but really aren't. And Barbara Brown safely infuses oil with select herbs.
This is one plant that even the novice gardener probably recognizes. Irises are a staple in our garden. Being drought tolerant, low maintenance, and low on fertility as far as the requirements, soil requirements go, it's no wonder they're a classic in the garden. And often they're the only sign that a garden might have existed, as you find them growing out in pastures or around old homesteads. Iris got its name from the Greek goddess of rainbow, and they come in a rainbow of colors, and many of them are also now bred to be repeat bloomers, so get another display of flowers later in the season. While when irises aren't in bloom, like many of our other perennials, we just tend to ignore them. But actually, midsummer is really the best time to pay attention to your irises as far as dividing them. If you've noticed that the flower production started to decline last spring, you might want to think about dividing your bearded iris. Bearded iris grow by rhizomes, and a lot of times you can even see those rhizomes on the soil surface because they don't like to be buried too deep. So in order for us to get in there and divide these, we're going to cut the foliage back to about 4 to 6 inches just with our hedge trimmers here. And that actually will preserve some of the moisture of the plant as we divide it. Once you've got that foliage cut back, it allows you to really see those rhizomes better so you know where to dig so you don't do any damage. And the best tool to use is either a garden fork or a spade. And again, try to steer clear of some of those rhizomes and then just go ahead and pry them up out of the ground. They usually come up pretty easy because they're not typically buried too deep. And you can use some of the remaining vegetation to kind of pull them up and go ahead and just pry that clump out of the ground. Now you can see quite the mass of rhizomes up here, and rhizomes are actually underground stem tissue. So this is the larger area, and then you do have some true roots here. So you want to kind of tease off some of that dirt off of the roots, and that'll allow you to break up those rhizomes even more. You'll notice some of these rhizomes are already starting to come apart. So for instance, right here, we have one. This in itself can be replanted. So this is really the ideal sort of look that we're going for. You want a couple inches, one that has plenty of roots still on it, and a few flags or leaves. So this is a good one. So we'll set this aside. If it was a plant that you wanted to share with somebody, you could write the color on the leaves and then go ahead and pass that along to them. Now you'll notice here, this is something you want to be cautious of. Right here we've got one that is sort of rotting. It's kind of moldy, it's soft, it's rotten in there. So this is going to just be discarded. It doesn't have any roots on it and it has no flags. And so we want to cut that off of the other rhizomes to remove that rot. So we're just going to start kind of teasing this apart, and you don't have to be really too gentle with it. In fact, you probably have to use some force a little bit and break those apart. And as we do that, you're going to find there are some areas, like this particular one, that it has some leaves over here on the end. Let's see how these leaves have declined. There's some new growth coming on there. There's some white roots here. But we're going to go ahead, and this has got some new growth on it, but we're going to go ahead and divide this and take it apart. So we're just going to use our knife. You can use a knife or scissors or whatever you might have. It's really best too to divide it where it's already segmented. Either it's forked, or you can see how it kind of comes to a pinch right there and right here. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this off right there. So when you're looking for a new location to plant your irises, you want to keep in mind that irises need full sun in order to have their best flower production. They also really like well-drained soil. They don't want to sit in moisture because that will cause those rhizomes to rot. So here we are next to some daylilies in full sun, and we're going to go ahead and plant our irises that we've dug, a few of them. Now, really, it's not too hard to plant irises because you want to err on the side of not planting them too deep. I'm just going to kind of turn the soil over because we will want to bury the fibrous roots, but we don't want to bury the rhizomes. So as you can see, we've left the rhizomes, just the top of them exposed slightly. It's really best to err on the side of caution and put your rhizomes a little bit higher than it is to bury them too deep, because lack of drainage and water will rot those rhizomes really quickly. So if you are concerned about that, plant them a bit higher. Now, doing this now will allow these iris to get established before the winter sets in. So you want to look at dividing your bearded iris mid-summer, around August. Also, there's other 4 factors that you really should think about. So if your irises have declined in their flower production in the spring, keep in mind that they need full sun. If they're not blooming, they likely have too much shade. Also, you want to make sure that they're not overcrowded, that they don't have too much soil fertility. They really like the kind of bad soil. That's one of the nice things about this plant. And again, the final thing is not to bury those rhizomes too deep. So too much shade, too deep, too much soil nutrition, and also overcrowding. Those are the 4 factors that can really be problematic for iris. Keeping those 4 things in mind, that should alleviate any problems and allow you to have a rainbow of color in your garden next spring. It can be a tricky situation to plant grass in a shady environment, such as under a tree, but there are a few grasses that can handle these shady environments, and one of those is northern sea oats or inland sea oats that we have here. This is Chasmanthium latifolium, and you can see it gets to a nice height of 2 to 3 feet. And what's neat about this plant is it offers a unique seed head that has these kind of flat fish-like. It's also called fish on a pole because it tends to look like fish dangling from a fishing pole. Now, although this is native to eastern United States, it can be an aggressive reseeder because these seeds are viable, so you want to be aware of that. But a way to control those seeds from growing is to simply cut those back and enjoy the foliage. These seed heads that you cut off, you can actually put those panicles into cut flower arrangements, and they offer a nice kind of texture to those arrangements. Now, what makes this even a tougher plant is the fact that you can plant it even under a black walnut tree. We also have another shade-tolerant ornamental grass that can handle being planted under a black walnut, and that's Japanese forest grass that you can see here. It kind of has a more of a bamboo-like texture in its foliage that weeps over, which really makes it nice for the front of your garden, and even it works really well in container gardens to kind of drape over those pots, the edge of the pots. Now this grass can get kind of a lime green in heavier shade, but you do want to make sure to kind of incorporate it into a heavier shade in southern climates and in Oklahoma because it really prefers to have that break from our summer heat. Another alternative for you to use in the shade is blue fescue. Now, unlike Chasmanthium, this is anything but aggressive. In fact, this plant is just going to stay where you put it. It really is actually considered a short-lived perennial in Oklahoma. And in hot, humid environments like we have here in Oklahoma, you might find that it actually has some dieback on its foliage. Now, the other thing here, I think the reason why we've been somewhat lucky with our little stand here is because it is in a raised bed. This plant cannot tolerate wet soils, and you will quickly see it die if you do put it in wet soils. While this plant can be somewhat fussy, once you have found its ideal location, it's going to offer you these nice tan seed heads that rise above this lovely blue clump of grass, and really is a nice alternative for the shade garden. Now, if none of these have really struck your fancy, there are a few other options, but the ones that we've mentioned here are true grasses in the Poaceae family. Stay tuned as we explore more options of ornamental grasses that aren't really true grasses. All true grasses belong to the plant family called Poaceae. With over 700 genera and about 12,000 species, it's the 5th largest plant family. Now, when we talk about ornamental grasses, however, not all ornamental grasses are true grasses. Starting us off, one of the most common ornamental grasses that we often talk about is monkey grass, or some people call it lily turf. Now, this is not actually a true grass, as it's in the family Asparagaceae. Now, there's 2 typical species that we often have in our garden landscape, and that's Liriope muscari, which has a much wider leaf to it and also is not quite as aggressive. It will spread. Now, Liriope spicata is one that we also often have, and that one is very much more aggressive than muscari, but it has a narrower leaf to it, so that's one way to tell them apart. Now, other than that, they both get to be about a foot tall. They're very low maintenance and can handle most environmental conditions. They both come in a range of flowers between whites to purples and blues, and then they also can be solid green or a variegation. Now, what's nice about this is they handle really good shade conditions, and so sometimes we have trouble getting our turf grass to grow in shady climates, but this works well under those trees. It is very low maintenance. It really doesn't require anything during the season. The only maintenance that it requires is, like some of your other perennial ornamental grasses, it's going to need to be cut back in late winter, in February, early March, before that new vegetation starts to emerge. That'll allow you to have the dead gone, so you only see the nice green leaves coming through the next season. Now, the other thing that's a dead giveaway on this, that it's not in the Poaceae family, is those flowers, when they start to bloom, they're going to turn later on to fruits that almost look like little blackberries or blueberries on there. And so that's another giveaway that this is not in the Poaceae family. Staying in the same plant family but a different genus, we have mondo grass that's also considered an ornamental grass. Now, while this looks very similar to the monkey grass, the flowers actually are going to be a soft pink bell shape to them instead of a spike of flowers. Now, this particular cultivar is called nigrescens, which is one of the darkest, blackest perennials that is out there on the market. You can see how it's got that nice dark vegetation to it. Now, most mondo grasses will get about 8 to 12 inches tall, but there is dwarf cultivars on the market that will remain 1 to 2 inches in height. Another plant that's often mistaken for a grass is sweet flag. Now, sweet flag, while it's never been in the Poaceae family, was in the arum family, but recently moved into its own family, the Poaceae family. The reason why it was moved was because it does not have the spathe-like flower that you often see in the arums. It's called sweet flag because when you crush it, it releases a sweet fragrance. Now, this is a perennial, being hardy from zones 5 to 9. Now, you want to make sure it's got plenty of moisture because the first signs of dryness will actually scorch the leaves, and you'll see some browning in those leaves. The other thing, to kind of get it through the heat of our summer, it does really appreciate some shade, so make sure that you have it in a partly shady condition. Otherwise, it probably will look worse in August. This particular cultivar is called Ogon, and it has kind of a yellow variegation to it and gets about a foot tall. There is a species that has naturalized in North America because it was introduced in the 1600s, and so you might find it growing in the wild. But there is a cultivar that's called variegatus that gets 2 to 3 feet tall that is on the market and looks similar to the vegetation that you find in a variegated iris. There's another group of grass lookalikes that we often know about in the home landscape, and that's sedges. Now, some sedges are considered weeds, such as yellow and purple nut sedge, but there are some sedges or carex that we like in our home landscape. One of the more popular genus species is Carex oshimonensis, and this is one of those cultivars. Now, most carex prefer part shade, and they can really stress in the heat of the summer. So you want to make sure they have plenty of moisture around their roots. This particular cultivar is called Eversheen, and it has a strong lime yellow midrib and glossy green margins. Now, there are several other cultivars on the market. Everrio, which forms a bigger clump and has overall yellow foliage. There's Evergold, which has a yellowish midrib with green margins. And Everlime, in contrast, has lime green margins and a green midrib. All of these will form about a 1 foot high clump, and they make nice plants to put in the front of your shade garden, or also they're nice accent plants for your containers. As the old saying goes, sedges have edges and rushes are round, and that's because rushes have round stems to them. This particular rush is called Blue Dart, which has a nice blue-green foliage to it, and you can see it's very upright. It's got strong vertical lines to add to your landscape, and it doesn't tend to flop as much as some of the other ornamental grasses that we've mentioned, so it's going to give you this strong vertical element into your garden. Now, this particular rush, as some of the other rushes, they work well in moist conditions, are a great addition to your shade garden, being hardy from zones 2 to 9. Corkscrew rush will give you a different look with its very curly stems. It almost adds more of a whimsical touch to the garden. It makes a great plant to add to the water garden, or one that you add into a container that is well watered. Horsetail rush is another plant commonly used as a bog plant in water gardens, but it's not a grass, nor is it a rush, as the name may suggest. Equisetum is the only surviving genus of a class of primitive vascular plants that dates back about 350 million years ago. While they are not ferns either, they are a bit more similar because instead of flowers, they reproduce by spores. It is also often called scouring rush because Native Americans used the stems of this plant, which are ribbed and have a high content of silica, to scrub their pots and pans. As a native, it is most often found along streams and in wet conditions. Although this is a native plant to North America, I always say there's a reason that it has outlasted the dinosaurs. With its rhizomatous root system, it's a very aggressive spreader, even in unideal conditions. Even though none of these that we've mentioned are true grasses, they offer the same versatility with minimal maintenance, just like the other true ornamental grasses. There you have it. We have covered ornamental grasses, from annuals to perennials, natives to shade-loving, even grasses that aren't really true grasses. We have covered all the ornamental grasses that are available, and with such versatility, I know there's one that's perfect for your garden.
Infusing oil with garlic or herbs has been something that a lot of people want to do. You can find it on the market if you go to a specialty shop, or even at the supermarket you can find oil with some kind of an herb in it. But we've recommended that people not do it very much at home because of the potential for developing botulism toxin, which is deadly. So the only way that you could do it is to infuse the oil with a herb or the garlic and keep it on the room temperature for 2 or 3 days, or put it in the refrigerator for a couple of months. But that's not what generally folks want to do. Researchers, however, as we progress with science, have found a way to do this and enable you to keep it at room temperature for a fairly long time. So we're going to go through that. There are very specific directions that you have to follow, and you'll be able to find those connected with the show. But you can only do it with garlic, and any kind of garlic will work. And then you can do it with 3 herbs. You can do it with basil, rosemary, or oregano. That's it. So follow it with those. You can mix the herbs. Garlic and herbs don't mix together, so make a plan and stick with the instructions as closely as you can. It's kind of like canning with low-acid food. You have to follow specific researched instructions in order to safely do it, and it's the same thing and the same reason. It's the botulism issue. So I've got 2 cups of warm water, and I'm going to add citric acid to that, 1 level tablespoon of citric acid, and you're going to stir that in the warm water until it's completely dissolved. Now, citric acid you can find, it's the same stuff we use when we can tomatoes if you don't want to use commercially bottled lemon juice. You can find it in some stores in the canning section. Most pharmacies will also carry it, so you should be able to find it. The powdered kind is going to work great. That's ready to go. Now, I've got this two ways. I've got the garlic done and I've got it done ahead. Now, in order for this to work, what we're going to be doing is we've got the citric acid, which is going to acidify what we're putting in. Botulism toxin will not be developed in an acid medium. So we're acidifying the garlic. I've got about 2/3 of a cup of garlic here, and it's been sitting overnight in the citric acid mixture. But let's back up and see what we do with the herbs. With the herbs, I've got about 1.5 cups loosely packed. As I said, you can mix them, so I've got oregano and rosemary here. We want to make sure that it's submerged. Notice that the garlic has not got a problem with that because it sinks, but the herbs tend to float, and we want to make sure that everything is under the acid medium. So in order to make this work, we're going to put another bowl on top of that. That's going to keep it under the water, and we're going to let that sit for 24 hours. If it needs to go a little longer, that's okay, but you don't want it to go less. Now, because there's chlorophyll in here, the color on this is going to change and not be nearly as attractive later. But we need to make sure that everything in the bottle is acidified. So even though you're going to lose the color, you can leave some of these herbs in the oil when it's stored, but you can't put a fresh sprig in because it won't have been acidified as you do so. I'm going to set these aside, room temperature, 24 hours. You can probably cover that with a towel or something just to make sure nothing else gets in it as well. Now, this is the garlic that we've had acidifying for a little over 24 hours. As I said, a little bit longer is fine, a little bit less is not. And we're ready to move forward on this and actually combine it with the oil. The acid has penetrated the garlic. The other thing you need to notice is that this garlic is chopped. You want to get it so that it's chopped in about 1/4 inch pieces, not any more if possible. You can see I've got whole garlic here. The problem with whole garlic as opposed to the chopped garlic is the acid is not going to penetrate in the same rate. And so you'll have pieces that are not acidified, and again, you run the risk of having toxin develop as a result. And the next step is to try and get as much water out of here as you can. So I'm actually going to pat the garlic a little bit dry with some paper towels, just to make sure I get as much oil or as much water out as I can, because that will cause the oil to deteriorate later. So roll that up, let it dry. And now we're ready to mix it with the oil. Now, how much you actually are going to mix in with your oil is going to be dependent a little bit on you. The researchers found that 1 part garlic to 10 parts of oil. So I have 10 parts of oil here for about for comparing tablespoons, 10 tablespoons, and that's probably a little bit too much. Again, it's not critical that it's too much or too little. You're going to put that in the oil, and you're going to let that sit and marinate for a period of 1 to 10 days. Now, the other thing I want to do is I want to transfer this. And it probably would have been easier if I put the oil into the jar first instead of having to transfer them both. But I'm transferring it to the jar where the storage is going to take place. Now, one of the things I want to happen here is you notice it's a dark jar. And these are this is a canning jar, and I generally don't recommend the dark variety simply because you can't tell if there's a problem with spoilage later on in canned foods. But with this oil deteriorates when it's warm and when light is getting into it. So with a dark jar, we can let this sit for about 10 days and keep it in a dark, cool place as well, and we're going to have less deterioration of the oil. Now, normally what you'd want to do is fill this jar up a little bit more, so make twice as much as I did this time. And the reason for that is simply because when you have more in the jar, you're going to have a smaller surface area or less air in the jar, and that's going to allow less of the deterioration or the oxidation of the oils going on. The other thing that you probably should look at is what kind of oil you're using. I used olive oil because garlic and olive oil go together well. They're often used in the same foods. The same could be done with the herbs because of the same reasons. You could also use canola oil, And because the fatty acid profile is very similar, they don't have as many polyunsaturated fatty acids as do some of the other types of oil. And so they're going to deteriorate more slowly than some of those would. So that there's a lot of information that you need to read through and follow through. But this is going to go in, as I've said, put a lid on it, cool, dark place. And this is going to take about 10 days. Now, after those 10 days are up, start checking it a little bit, maybe 5, 6, 7 days, and find out how strong the oil is getting. When it's as strong as you want it to taste, it's done. And you can filter out the garlic. If you don't want to filter out the garlic, that's fine, but it's going to keep getting stronger and stronger in taste, and you may get to the point where you don't like it anymore. So check it every once in a while, make sure it's okay. Again, don't put in a fresh clove of garlic to make it look pretty if you strain this stuff out, because it won't be acidified. Don't put in fresh herbs. You're going to do basically the same thing with if you use herbs, but don't put in fresh ones, because again, they're not going to be acidified. The botulism toxin question arises again at that point. A lot of specifics to follow. It's really not hard though. The hardest thing to do is probably chopping all that garlic. I hope you'll give it a try. Make your own infusion at home. For Oklahoma Gardening, this is Barbara Brown.
Next week, Casey will put the heat to our Bermuda grass eradication project. We will thin our pecan crop load. We'll peer into what makes a grass. And Barbara Brown will help us select a safe and useful used pressure canner. We wish you health and wellness, and we'll see you next week for more Oklahoma Gardening. To find out more information about show topics, as well as recipes, videos, articles, fact sheets, and other resources, including a directory of local extension offices, be sure and visit our website, oklahomagardening.okstate.edu. And we always have great information, answers to questions, photos, and gardening discussions on your favorite social media as well. Join in on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can find this entire show and other recent shows, as well as individual segments on our Oklahoma Gardening YouTube channel. And tune in to our OK Gardening Classics YouTube channel to watch segments from previous hosts. Oklahoma Gardening is produced by the Oklahoma Cooperative Extension Service as part of the Division of Agricultural Sciences and Natural Resources at Oklahoma State University. The Botanic Garden at OSU is home to our studio gardens, and we encourage you to come visit this beautiful Stillwater jewel. We would like to thank our generous underwriter, the Oklahoma Department of Agriculture, Food, and Forestry. Additional support is also provided by Pond Pro Shop, Greenleaf Nursery and the Garden Debut Plants, the Oklahoma Horticultural Society, and the Tulsa Garden Club.